And joining us now on the debate, Katie Telford, Senior Consultant with Strategy Corp and a former Liberal advisor. Paul Rhodes, former Communications Director for the Ontario PC Party. Jerry Kaplan, former NDP strategist. Jim Harris, former leader of the Green Party of Canada. And Martin Regg-Conn, Ontario politics columnist at the Toronto Star. Good to have everybody in for this first program of our sixth season here on TVO. I want to start by showing some numbers. Michael, if you would, let's take everybody back to the returns from 2007. And the Liberals, of course, won their second consecutive majority on the strength of 42% of the polls, the PCs at 32, NDPs at 17, and the Greens at 8. Since then, the numbers have danced around quite a bit. In September of 2010, it was the Conservatives who had a big lead, 12 points over the Liberals. NDP still in the low 20s, Greens maintaining at 8. End of August this year, where were the polls? Tightening. A 7-point Conservative lead, NDP in the game, Greens down to 6. And of course, Nick Nanos has a poll out in the last couple of days that shows that that gap has tightened even more. It's a 3.5-point Conservative lead, according to Nick Nanos, with the NDP still in the game. Martin, what do those numbers say to you?
Well, the latest numbers show that it's going to be one of the most wide-open races we've had in Ontario for a long time. I think the gap between the Conservatives and the Liberals is narrowing, and it's a very quick turnaround. One thing I would say with some confidence, without trying to be provocative to my friend Jim here, is I think the Green vote may come down a little bit. I think it was over 6 in the last election, and it's more likely to come a little bit, to nibble down a little bit. And the NDP is destined to go up on current trends. The rest I would not venture to go beyond.
Okay, Jim, you want to come back on that?
Well, absolutely. First off, we were 8% in the last election, which was fantastic. And the Green vote is really like a one-way street. Once you realize we're destroying the planet, it's hard to unthink that. And so Green voters in some ways are like going down a one-way street. The commitment deepens because people are concerned about their children's future.
Katie, what do the numbers say to you?
Just quickly on the comment about the environment, I think it's going to be really interesting to watch. I think this may be what Martin was alluding to, whether the Green numbers hold this time, given the environmental record that the Liberal government has. They've got every endorsement possible, it seems, on the Green file, and including David Suzuki. So it'll be interesting to see whether we see movement from Greens over to Liberals, because I can't understand how the Greens do otherwise. But overall, in terms of the numbers, I don't know that they mean much. I think everybody's known this was going to be a horse race. If anything, it says to campaign managers a good message, which is tell your campaign workers to get out there and work hard, and they can see in the numbers there's good reason to do so.
Paul?
I think what you see in the 2010 results are the combination of the anger from the HST and the eco-taxes, which came as a huge surprise to the public. I think the Liberals did very good job in selling the HST, but eco-taxes came as a surprise. But if you take a look at the polls from 2007, not during the election, but before, you'll find the Liberals held a 4 to 5% lead over the Conservatives of John Tory, and that moved to a 10-point gap during the course of the election campaign. So I don't think the narrowing in advance comes as a surprise to anyone, but it does say that during an election, things happen. And what you saw was a collapse of the Conservative vote in 2007, and in 2011, we'll see what happens then.
Sure.
I think it's exciting and it's unpredictable. I think anything could happen and something will that none of us can foresee at the moment. But I also think it's probably the closest chance we've had for minority government in a long time. In fact, it's hard to see if you were betting why that wouldn't be the logical linear outcome. But of course, well, just look at the figures. If the NDP stays anywhere in the 20s at all, it's all it takes, anywhere between 19 to 23 or 4 or 5. It's very hard for one of the other parties to get the 42 or 44 that they need for majority. So I think that's a real possibility, and that makes it all exciting. And coalition governments or minority governments have been awfully good for Ontario in the last 35 or 40 years. If anybody has lived that long besides me.
We haven't had one in 25 years.
We have not.
Yeah, 26, I guess. Are you talking to Conservatives who are concerned about the fact that what was once a 12-point lead is now a 3.5-point lead on the eve of the call?
I think the body language, I think the tone is one of some concern. I think they recognize that at the end of the day, and I'm sorry for indulging in so much personality politics and horse race-ism, but for Conservatives, at the end of the day, it depends on whether people will like Tim. Hudak, by the way, is who I mean by Tim. Not many people know the opposition leader. That's not uncommon for an Ontario election. I think the NDP has the same challenge. They can't ride on the coattails of Jack Layton. They have to introduce their leader. They know that, Andrea Horwath. That's a traditional challenge for the NDP as well. But I think Conservatives are definitely watching the polls closely, and they recognize, they're professionals, that it's wide open.
If you were working this campaign the way you worked 95 and 99, how concerned would you be about the fact that 12 points is now 3.5 points?
Not at all. Not at all, because races tighten, polls tighten before the race. There is a reset button that will be hit tomorrow when the Lieutenant Governor issues the election writs, and then everything's up for grabs. We have seen huge shifts in past campaigns, from Mike Harris from 26 into the mid-40s. We've seen huge collapses in campaigns, David Peterson in 1999 to Bob Rae's coming up. So when elections are called, everything's new and different. People will get the chance to meet Tim Hudak, meet Andrea Horwath, may recalibrate their views of Dalton McGuinty as well, because the Liberals have done a very good job in reducing some of the anger around McGuinty, because it's hard to stay angry for a long time.
Well, let me follow up.
But does
on
it
that.
come back up?
I want to follow up on that with Katie, because I think the last poll I saw suggested Dalton McGuinty was the second least popular premier in the country. I mean, how happy are you going into the election campaign knowing that that's out there?
That's why I loved the ad that they just had, or that's, I guess, still out there, and I keep seeing on all my shows, so I don't know if that's targeted directly at me, but where he essentially, he faces that issue head on and says, I may not be the most popular guy, or something along those lines, but that's not what I need to be. I mean, those aren't his exact words, but essentially he's saying, I'm running for premier here, and I've got to make tough decisions. And in some ways, that brand of leadership and making tough decisions, being willing to make tough decisions, and making the right decisions for Ontario has allowed for things like the HST, which at one time might have been seen as a shield or a defensive issue for the Liberals, almost to become a sword issue for him, because we've seen the opposition showing no alternative to the HST, for example.
Well, let me try this with Jerry Kaplan now. 21 years ago today, Dalton McGuinty got elected for the first time as an MPP.
Muzzle tov.
He's got like
Give him my best.
I shall do that.
All right.
I was only raising that by way of saying he's been in public life a long time. He's got a lot of experience. Tim Hudak's been in for 16 years, got a lot of experience. Andrea Horwath is a real newbie to this game. How concerning is that to the NDP?
I think there's pluses and minuses for all three of them, some of them big in all cases. I was struck with a Nanos, I can't keep up, there were two polls, showing that 80% of Ontarians had either a negative or a no opinion whatsoever about Hudak. I thought that was pretty remarkable because he's been pretty busy for a year and a half. Horwath can do it either way. You're either very inexperienced and your inexperience shows and you end up being on the television debate and you sweat and you're awkward, or you blast it, right? You come through and you put it all together, and nobody has the slightest idea how any of them are going to do. I think McGuinty playing the avuncular role is potentially quite attractive, quite attractive. I think politicians who get up and say, I don't care about the polls, I only do what's important, not because it's popular. I wouldn't use that line very much myself, Katie.
Too precious, you think?
I think nobody in the world believes it. You know that anybody who says that doesn't believe it or they wouldn't say it.
Okay. I want to ask you about Mike Schreiner, who is the name that, well, this is why I asked. Mike Schreiner is the leader of the Green Party of Ontario, and once you meet him, he's a very affable guy and everybody likes him. John Tory, I believe, hosted a fundraiser for him. The former leader of the Ontario PC Party and a guy with a pretty good radio show. But the fact is, you guys don't have money to take out ads to let everybody know who he is, and nobody does know who he is. How big a problem is that for you right now?
Well, the Greens don't focus on personality. We focus on the issues.
But guys like Martin focus on the personalities. The media focus on the personalities.
I understand.
Sorry, Martin, you're the one exception.
I understand that, but we're at a critical juncture, and Mike is the only one who's really talking about this decision to spend $33 billion on nuclear. And both the Liberals and the Conservatives support it. But by 2020, solar is going to be cheaper than nuclear, according to Stephen Chu, the Secretary of Energy for the U.S. So, Gretzky says, we're going where the puck is, not to where we want to go where the puck is going to be, not where it is.
He's running for you.
Yeah, but he's a great political commentator.
Wouldn't hurt you at all.
No, he'd be a good guy to have.
Too. I would love to have. Yeah.
But the really important thing is both the parties that will likely form the government are committing us to a 40-year program of the most expensive energy. So Mike is out there, and he has been campaigning relentlessly for the last year and a half in communities, talking about the issues that matter to them.
Let me follow up on that.
Can I just say, though, that,
Sure.
that Elizabeth May has shown that personality does matter to the Greens, and I think by the virtue of the force of her personality, she gave the Greens more of a platform, so I do think it matters. I do think that we shouldn't forget the NDP, though. They also are opposed to nuclear, but it still hasn't had much traction for them either.
As long as we're on this issue, let's get to some of the issues that we're told are going to be decisive in this election campaign, starting with, since you're on it, Jim, energy. Katie, I know the Liberals think they've got a good story to tell on their Green Energy Act. It's also been demonized quite successfully by the opposition politicians. Where do you see this going?
I think they're talking about jobs and the economy, and they've done a nice job of linking the two, as well as broadening the economy and issues related to the economy and jobs to education, along with energy. And the fact that the energy file is something where the Premier has, as I mentioned earlier, has gotten endorsements from across the board. When Jim mentions nuclear, and it's the only differentiation now that the Green Party really has that I'm aware of on the energy file relative to the Liberal Party.
I'm not sure the voters in Puslinch, though, care whether David Suzuki's in favor of Premier McGuinty's energy plans. You know what I'm saying?
I don't know, David Suzuki's a pretty popular guy
Yes,
out
he
there.
is. Yes, he is. But that can play both ways. Would you agree?
I'm not sure, actually.
Maybe you wouldn't agree.
I'm not sure.
You tell me. What do you think?
Well,
Is
I
energy
think
an
when
issue in this?
people, absolutely, when people pick up their electricity bill and see higher and higher rates, rates where you have to, if you want any form of saving, do your laundry in the middle of the night. Add to that the HST.
Not the middle of the night, after 7 o'clock.
Well, after 7 o'clock.
After
Well,
7
some of us
o'clock.
go to bed
I
early.
was
So
going to say, for me, that's
yeah, if you get a little bit, a few years on, you like to go to bed earlier, and there is absolutely voter anger there, and where I think this is, as Tom Walcom pointed out in the Toronto Star, big ideas done too fast and done in an incompetent fashion. When you're paying 80 cents a kilowatt hour for solar-generated electricity, while at the same time paying consumers in New York and Quebec to take the excess power that you have, clearly incompetent is the best way to describe
Does
it.
it matter?
It's not to say it's a bad thing, and you wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but a $7 billion sole source contract to a single company, it's the way it was done. And I go back to Tom Walcom's, not that I'm reading the Toronto Star other
Sounds
than
like you are.
religiously,
Yeah.
that when he comes in and describes it as incompetent, I think that's where the accountability has to
But
finally
you know,
get
just
On
put
that,
forward.
the criticism seems to be about process or how it was done, as you just said, as opposed to what's being done and the results that the Premier has been delivering on this. And at the end of the day, isn't that what people care about? Is they care about the jobs actually arriving in their cities.
The results are communities in my very county that can decide where a Tim Hortons restaurant goes, but have no choice when huge windmills go in. And there is an anger and resentment about, it's not process rolling over communities, when at the same time, you have the good people in Oakville who've been relieved from a gas plant, and there is an outstanding bill that's going to be covered for that, based strictly on politics as opposed to need.
But we have to be careful here when we're talking about the issue. The issue was, is environment going to be a vote determining issue? And when you mention green energy, I think we'll agree that that actually isn't what's raising rates. Green energy and the high rates that are being paid to incentivize, sorry for using that word, Steve, to give incentives to investors is a small percentage of the overall hydro mix. Mm-hmm. So that's not what's raising hydro rates now. What's raising is investing and paying for the infrastructure and the transmission lines and so on, which Katie will tell you were neglected by the progressive conservative government. As for the $7 billion, I can't let the $7 billion go by, Paul, because is it a sole source $7 billion contract? That's a $7 billion investment that Samsung will be making in Ontario. Let's agree on the facts. There was a $400 million incentive clause which is being reduced. So there's an attempt to scratch the itch about hydro rates. Were you involved in it?
No, have you seen it?
No, I've not.
I think they actually did make it public.
release
They did
the
make it
details
public
of it,
eventually. Yeah. Jim, come in on
After
that.
years of
Let me hear
pressure.
Jim
So why
and
the
Jerry on this.
So the first thing to say for this is that for half the price of what the new nuclear program is going to cost, we could insulate 1.6 million homes and businesses in Ontario and save as much energy as the nuclear would cost. and create a multiple more of jobs, more than 10 times more jobs. And not just jobs in Darlington, but every single community in Ontario. So that would insulate us ultimately against rising energy prices. That is going to be far better, create more jobs, be an economic stimulus, and not commit us to the most expensive form of energy. I'd like to pick up on what Martin said about the 80 cents a kilowatt hour. Solar right now is 0.1% of the total energy mix. So for the Conservatives, Tom Adams and Hudak, to go around saying it's driving up electricity prices is a blatant untruth.
Because it's just not affecting 99.9% of the rest of the mix.
Yeah,
I wasn't aware
exactly.
that Tom Adams was a conservative. That's a new
Well,
on
he's
me.
quoted
That
a lot
is
by the
just more.
Conservatives.
I need to hear from Jerry on this. Energy is an election issue.
I have no idea, and I'm not exactly illuminated by this conversation. This is everybody has disagreed on everything they've said. A whole lot of facts and figures have been thrown out, which I can't already remember, and have no idea if they were right in the first place. So when you say, is energy policy going to be an issue? It is not. Somebody is going to catch on maybe to some slogan that's going to make us think that maybe we don't have to pay as much. Back to where Paul said. For most of us, for me, I don't understand all this fancy stuff about nuclear. What I understand is how much it costs, and it's a lot.
Here's a very simple energy plank that the NDP have put forward in their policy book. They're going to take the tax off gasoline when you gas up at the pumps. Jim is already shaking his head because he knows that that's not green policy. I mean small green, let alone big green. What do you think of that idea, Jerry?
I am not here on behalf of the NDP,
Correct.
and I don't have to agree with everything they do.
Therefore?
And I happen to be with Jim in terms of believing that a climate catastrophe is virtually at our door, and that everything possible should be done in every possible way to meet it and to meet that impossible challenge. I'm worried about your baby. I'm worried about my granddaughter.
So it's dumb policy.
So it's not where I would have gone.
Listen, the interesting thing, what I think we might all agree on, perhaps with the exception of Paul, but to pick up on Jerry's point, I don't think hydro and energy actually is a big issue. The polls, for what they're worth, show that it actually is way down the list after jobs, the economy, health, education, and so on. So it's more of how much are you going to scratch the itch? And if you throw around numbers, and if you ask people, are you mad about an HST? Do you want to have your gasoline tax reduced? People will tend to tell pollsters yes. Will that be a vote-determining issue? I don't think so.
Why don't you think so?
I think people are more preoccupied by bigger issues rather than getting 4 cents off a fill-up on gasoline prices or having the debt reduction charge removed from their hydro rates. I'm not sure they believe that these rebates will eventually come through. I think people are more preoccupied by economic uncertainty.
Let me ask about the HST.
I think I think there's some truth there, but I also, and I'm not disagreeing with you, but are you concerned about the big issues? Yes, but there seems to be a lack of concern in what's affecting individuals on a daily basis, which I think is what Tim Hudak is trying to put some attention to.
What about the HST, though, as a campaign issue? If it were as vile a tax, as you guys have been saying for the past couple of years that it is, why are you leaving it on basically 98% of what's taxable?
Taking it off carries with it a certain penalty, as the good voters in British Columbia are soon to find out, that makes it really bad to take it off at a time when you can't without incurring those penalties. It doesn't make economic sense.
If I were Dalton McGuinty, I would say with absolute confidence that if Tim Hudak had gone federal, as he could have, he would now be 100% supporter of the HST. It just depends where you sit and what your position is. So I can't imagine that they're going to get away with that, and I'm not sure the NDP is going to get very far with it.
When candidates move from municipal councils to provincial governments, they have different views. And when they move from provincial legislatures to federal legislatures, sometimes
But
views
there is
change,
a
and that happens in all
credibility
parties.
issue.
Paul, if I can be helpful, remember John Tory, when he did sit in the Ontario Leaders Chair, did support the HST and now supports the HST. So most provincial
is
Tories
helpful.
do support the
We
HST.
didn't support the healthcare tax. That was a
Jim,
different
is the Green Party in favor of the HST?
Well, what we're not in favor of is the HST being taken off energy. It's like all of a sudden, and all the parties, old line parties, want to have subsidies for energy, whether it's electricity or gas, by removing tax or having a direct subsidy. And that's like saying we're going to subsidize potato chip sales for students in high school while not promoting physical education. We want Canadian or Ontario businesses to get fat and energy inefficient so that when energy prices spike at some time in the future, they're just killed. We don't want to remove the HST off energy because businesses have to get energy efficient. That is both the economic and the ecological challenge of the 21st century.
Katie, these two issues are inextricably linked, and the fact is that the Liberal government is going to go off and borrow more than $1 billion in order to subsidize people's use of power. Is that a good way to get people to conserve?
I think
You're smiling. I think we know the answer. Go ahead.
And what else do you
it's the
think?
way you framed the question, though. It's like you were looking for a certain answer there. I think Premier McGuinty really has gone above and beyond on the environment side. On green energy, he's been talking about jobs. He's been talking about conservation nonstop for the last 4 years in particular, but also over the two terms of the mandate. And at the end of the day, I really agree with what Jerry said earlier. And the details on all of this is not what's going to be what matters in the ballot booth at the end of the day. It's going to be who they trust, whose leadership they ultimately trust on the issues that matter to them. As Paul said, where I would disagree with Paul is I'm not sure Hudak's speaking to that. I would veer a little more toward what Martin said, and I would be even a bit more specific, which is and McGuinty does well if he can make this be the case. I think people are caring about, when you mentioned my baby earlier, they're caring about where are they going to go to school and what's that school going to be like? Is there going to be turmoil in the schools? There has been peace in schools for 8 years.
Not in post-secondary, only in elementary and secondary.
Well,
Had the longest strike in post-secondary history.
But what the
under
Premier
McGuinty
just announced yesterday in his platform around post-secondary is pretty unprecedented as well. And it's going to be interesting to see what the NDP says in response to
Can
that.
I be partisan for 2
Please.
seconds so my friends out there don't get
Disown
on
you?
me after this? I think the trust issue is very important. And it appears that my friend Andrea has a pretty good chance there. I don't know what the female equivalent of avuncular is, but there's this kind of nice, ant-like, pleasant, trustworthy, honest, straightforward way she has. And if she doesn't blow it by repeating her card lines too often in a robotic way, which I must say other candidates we won't talk about here do all the time, she could impress and she could move up. And there is clearly some kind of vacuum in the province where people are looking for somebody that they can throw their support to.
Well, let me move along from HST to just T in general. 2003, Dalton McGuinty promised not to raise taxes. He signed the pledge from the Canadian Taxpayers Association not to raise taxes. He did raise taxes. 2007, he promised not to raise taxes. He did raise taxes. They are hitting you guys pretty hard on the head with the, you can't believe what this guy says on taxes. And if you look at his past record, do they have a case to make?
He's also cut taxes, and he's also committed to doing that again with small businesses. But the most important thing that he said is Ontarians they've done their part and on that front, and he's delivering results on other areas that you can absolutely trust him on, and that's why the decisions were made over the last 8 years. You can trust him on all the issues in terms of doing what's right for Ontarians and delivering the results that he's promised.
So raising taxes is right for Ontarians? Because when asked the question yesterday, he bobbled it. He signed it in 2003. He promised in 2007.
He said no when he was asked if he would raise taxes. He said no.
But I'll tell you, if you've seen the clip,
He said we will not.
that was
Did not use the word
He
taxes.
said no
He said
pretty
we will not.
definitively.
Let me
was
explain
the
to our
kind of thing I'd
listeners
take to
why
the
he did that. Because the
Yeah.
Tories, understandably and justifiably, are using clips from previous campaigns where he says, I will not raise taxes. So clearly McGuinty does not want to give Paul a free clip where he says,
Well, of
again,
course,
I will not raise
well,
taxes.
then
You
either
can
he
have a
believes
split
it or
screen
he
in real
won't.
time.
I think
say
it's a
it,
very
he
perverse.
didn't, he
Sorry,
doesn't.
I think it's an amazingly perverse conversation. We cannot function in Ontario much longer unless we have more revenue or slash policies and programs that nobody wants slashed except the Tea Party people, whoever they are. Not sure that's Hudak. I don't know who it is. You can't. And if we don't raise taxes from all kinds of levels, as hurtful as it going to be for ordinary people, we are not going to have social services. We are not going to have the infrastructure. We're not going to have the schools your daughter needs.
For argument's sake.
And somebody has to tell the truth about that.
For
one of
argument's
these
sake,
days.
you said the first time you said we have to raise revenues. The second time you said we have to raise taxes. Those aren't necessarily synonymous. You can raise revenues by having a better economy, and some people think if you raise taxes, you don't get a better economy.
I think the Ontario government has a limited purchase over the larger playing of the economy. I know every government comes in, or every opposition party, we did it ourselves, plays the jobless game, and we would create more jobs this way. It's very hard. Provincial governments don't affect the larger economy in any way. In fact, at the moment, I'm not sure the national government does. Depends what happens across the border, how we do. So we're not going to have revenues unless we have tax increases from somebody, the corporate sector.
I know the Greens are in favor of higher corporate taxes. You think that's good for the economy?
Yes and no. In fact, if you look at where's the engine of job growth, it's in small and medium-sized enterprises. So the Green Party platform has a very extensive tax reduction for small and medium-sized enterprises. And really, we want to change what taxes are charged. So we want to make sure that the tax on energy, for instance, is not reduced, as all the old line parties would want us to have. And instead, we reduce taxes on small business income so that we create jobs and wealth in the engine that drives Ontario. And this is part of a bigger picture. Federally, we have a government that supports the tar sands, and our dollar has become a petrodollar. The higher oil goes, the more it hollows out Ontario manufacturing. And so our manufacturing is getting killed because of a tar sands support. And so that's the federal conservative policy. We need to have job stimulus in the manufacturing sector for Ontario, and that's focused on small and medium-sized businesses.
Martin, tax policy, how's it playing out?
Well, I think Jerry raised an interesting point about taxes being turned into a dirty word by the Tories, but also under the influence of American political culture. But I think the New Democrats, provincially, not under Jerry's tutelage, have done a bit of an about-face and tried to play into that pocketbook platform issue, a bit of an echo of the Conservatives, because I think Tim Hudak owns that issue, rightly or wrongly. But the NDP has made a big deal about lowering the HST, lowering gas prices, gas taxes, and this has caused some dissension in the left. And so you have Ken Luenza, the Canadian Auto Workers, you have the OFL, the leader, Sid Ryan, saying to Andrea Horwath, look, you are spoiling it for the future, because if you undermine public support for taxes, you are undermining support for the public services that we as New Democrats think are important.
On the other hand, the NDP party numbers have not been this high in 21 years.
I don't think there's a correlation, though. I think that's I think that's something called Jack Layton's death, and I think taxes as I say, high taxes are way down. And if you ask people who do you trust on taxes, Andrea Horwath is way down at 11%.
I'm not sure. I mean, you take a look at those previous numbers. The NDP were at 22% in 2010. So I think it would be easy to ascribe the current bump to Jack Layton, but at the same time, I think it's reflective of people who are looking for a change, and when they make a decision to change, they moved away a year ago. Our numbers went up, NDP numbers went up. There has been a change in that as well over time, because it's hard to sustain anger. So I wouldn't ascribe the current NDP lift strictly to Jack Layton.
I think that's right. If 2010, it's 22%. Jack Layton was still at 18% across the country at that stage, you know, which he was until 3 weeks before the election campaign of May the 2nd.
All I'm saying is, if you look at the numbers, if 11% of Ontarians trust Andrea Horwath on taxes and 30% trust Dalton McGuinty and Tim Hudak on taxes, I don't think that's what's picking up the NDP. Or maybe we shouldn't be paying attention to polls at all.
I was going to say, though, I don't know that I would ascribe so much to the public numbers that we're seeing right now. If there was one lesson coming out of the federal election last spring, and pollsters were puzzling over it afterwards, we were seeing them on shows saying, how did we get it so wrong? The numbers they had going into that election and where the election ended up were two very different things.
Okay, with just a few minutes left here, we do want to, I'm glad Jack Layton's name was brought up here, because it is out there as a, people who do what you do in the back rooms or in journalism are talking about it and are curious as to how the Layton effect, if I can call it that, whether it has coattails. Liberals that I talk to are very concerned about Andrea Horwath's popularity, chipping away at their numbers, and at Mr. Layton's, whatever you want to call the amazing thing that just happened over the last few weeks in this city and country, what impact that could have. How do you see it, Katie?
A couple of things. Unfortunately, without Jack there, I wonder how much the Jack Layton effect will have from the last federal election till now. Because the orange wave, or the effect that we're talking about, really existed in the federal election last spring. It didn't just spring up in August, though that obviously brought it to the fore in a different way. It's going to have a couple of impacts, though, I think. One of them being that it's going to be potentially a bit of a distraction for the NDP this time. And what I mean by that is the leadership that's now going to be ongoing at the federal level. Yeah. We've got candidates from Ontario, potentially, one of them from the 416, Brian Topp, who's likely to be a candidate, or that's what everybody's hearing at the moment. And he's presumably going to be getting, union friends and others all active in Ontario over this exact period of time.
Jerry?
I haven't the slightest idea, and nobody I know understands what happened 2 weeks ago in Canada and what it represents. It'd be nice for me to think that Canada suddenly moved to become social democrats. I don't believe it. But something happened that was more than about a man. There were some kind of values. Does it translate to anything? Nobody knows, and I couldn't guess for 2 seconds.
I think the thing to remember in the federal campaign is the Orange Surge was a reality in Quebec. It happened to a lesser extent in Area Code 416, but elsewhere in Ontario it didn't happen. The Conservatives defeated a New Democrat in Oshawa, and in Sault Ste. Marie, a New Democrat incumbent was beaten by a Conservative. So I think the Orange Surge and the impact is, as far as Ontario is concerned, a definite factor in 416, maybe in Hamilton and Windsor, but in the rest of the province, it just didn't happen during the federal campaign in the way I think some people think it did.
30 to Jim, 30 to Martin.
I agree, absolutely. It was a Quebec phenomenon. But coming out of, Jack was a decent guy. I ran against him in '04 in Toronto Danforth, which was my home riding. And there was a sadness there for me. And ultimately, at the end of the day, all politicians are people. And so what I liked about his memory is that of having a better decorum in Parliament. And I've enjoyed this talk today. I think it's great to talk about ideas and not have personal attacks. And so I think that's the legacy Jack leaves us.
Martin.
Well, I hate making predictions, but what I would say retrospectively is that it would have been probably on balance more helpful to the New Democrats to have Jack Layton on stage, introducing Andrea Horwath, talking her up, and also advising her. As she said herself, she'll miss the conversations she had with him, and if there should be a minority government, which I think is a very strong possibility, I think Jack would have been a great advisor for Andrea Horwath, and she won't have that anymore.
I want to thank everybody, to echo our friend here from the Green Party, for such a civilized and not personal discussion here
It's what
today.
happens when you're former. Once you get out, everyone's friends.
You're all formers. Good stuff. Okay, there's Martin Redcon and Katie Telford on the right-hand side of the table, and on the other side of the table, Jim Harris from the Green Party, Paul Rhodes of the Progressive Conservative Party, and you get your own single shot, Jerry Kaplan, because that's just the kind of mood we're in tonight. Bravo.
Love it.
Thanks much, everybody. And oh, can I just take 30 seconds here to say, last time you were here, you were really, really, really pregnant. And you had George, and all is good. Is that right?
All is very good.
And you named George after Smitherman, of course.
No.
No, okay, just checking. Just checking.